Hello students, I am Kuntala Bhattacharya from Rabindra Bharati University, Kolkata. Today we will be discussing the doctrine of variegated non-dualism or Chitradvaitabhada, which emerged as a part of Buddhist idealism. The idealist school of Buddhism is variously known as Vijnanavada, Vijñaptimatratavada, Chinmatratavada, Yogachara school, and so on. So here I will generally use the term Vijnanavada. Vijnanavada doctrine holds that only consciousness is real and there is nothing external to consciousness. Within later Vijnanavada, there emerged two sub-schools, Sakara Vijnanavada or Satyakaravada. According to this view, whatever appears in consciousness is the form or akara of consciousness itself and is satya or real. Nirakara Vijnanavada or Alikakaravada, according to this view, consciousness does not have any form. Whatever appears in consciousness is unreal or alika. The doctrine of variegated non-dualism or Chitradvaitavada, as we have mentioned before, was presented as a part of Sakara Vijnanavada by philosophers like Ratnakirti. Today our discussion will be divided into two parts. In the first part, we will briefly discuss Sakara Vijnanavada, which provides the background for Chitradvaitavada. In the second part, we will discuss Ratnakirti's arguments for Chitradvaitavada as expressed in his essay entitled Chitradvaita Prakashavada. Now let us turn to the background of Chitradvaitavada, that is Sakara Vijnanavada. Vasubandhu, who belonged to 4th century CE, in his work Vingshatika argues that all this is consciousness only, as the objects which appear as external are unreal. Though Vasubandhu was thus in favor of extreme idealism, his arguments do not clearly indicate whether he regarded consciousness as imbued with forms or not. Later logician philosophers, namely Acharya Dingnaga, who belonged to the 6th century CE, and Dharmakirti, who belonged to 6th, 7th century CE, expressed a dual tendency. They developed their Pramana theory from a realist, that is, Sautrantika point of view, but in their philosophical and metaphysical discussions, they raised objections against realism and advocated idealism. However, in both these stances, they insisted that consciousness has a content or form, that is akara. Later Vijnanavadin philosophers such as Prajnakaragupta, who is of 10th century CE, 8th to 9th century CE actually, Gyaneshri Mitra and his disciple Ratnakirti, who belonged to 11th century CE, construed Dharmakirti as a Sakara Vijnanavadin. Now the question which is obvious here is, what is form of cognition? What is akara? All philosophical schools agree that in each instance of our ordinary cognition, we are aware of something, and this something which appears before us and which characterizes that cognition is the representation or form or akara that the cognition has. It is also commonly held that because cognition grasps these representations, which are therefore grasped or grajya, we can distinguish one grasping cognition, that means grahaka, from another. An awareness of blue, for example, is distinct from an awareness of yellow because they are characterized by different representations, that is, by blue and yellow respectively. Debate, however, centers on the question whether this representation is that of the external object which causes that perception to arise, or that of the perceptual cognition itself. Orthodox Indian realist schools like the Nyaya, Vaisheshika or Purva Mimamsa believe that cognition is related to the object by subject-object relation, but it does not assume the form of the object. This position can be called Nirakara Jnanavada. It does not, however, necessarily follow that realism always speaks in favor of Nirakara Jnanavada. The Sautrantika Buddhists, for example, in spite of being realists, were the first to propose the doctrine of momentariness or Kshanikatvavada, that is, the doctrine that an object is destroyed just at the next moment of its origination. But subscribing to such theory made ordinary perceptual cognition theoretically impossible, for if an object causing perception is destroyed at the very next moment of its origination, it will not be existent when, after some optic neurological processes, it appears before the perceiver as the form or content of perception. But can we say that I now perceive blue color when that blue color is, in fact, non-existent at that moment? In order to resolve this difficulty, the Sautrantikas say that before an object is destroyed, it leaves its impression or likeness in cognition. The content of cognition has similarity or resemblance with the object, artha sarupya. That is why Dharmakirti in Nyayavindu regards having similarity with the object, that is artha sarupya, as pramana. It may be noted here that since the Buddhist philosophers do not distinguish between the property and the propertied object, there is no difference, therefore, between the resemblance or similarity with the object and the cognition which bears that resemblance, artha sarupya yukta jnana. But this Sautrantika criterion of pramana becomes problematic, and Dharmakirti questions it in Pramana Vartika. Since the external object which causes such awareness is never directly perceived, Dharmakirti argues, whether its cognition is pramana or not cannot be verified. The claim that what is represented is comparable to things existing in the external world is like comparing a portrait with a sitter, but without being given any access to the sitter except via the portrait. Hence, it turns out that what one perceives directly is not the form of the object, but the form of cognition. In other words, the form manifested in perceptual cognition is that of the cognition itself. This doctrine, that the content of perceptual cognition is in fact the altered cognition, is a kind of Vijñanavada known as Sakara Vijñanavada. It may also be noted here that this position is common to both the Sautrantikas and the Vijñanavadins. The difference lies on the question about the cause of the form of the cognition. According to the Sautrantikas, the form of the cognition is contributed by the external object, which is called the alambana pratyaya. According to the Vijñanavadins, on the other hand, the form of the cognition is due to past impression, vasana, or immediately preceding cognition, which is its samanantara pratyaya.